Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the third installment in my series comparing Games Workshop to OnePage Rules. Today, we're going to be talking about community. So in this video, I'm going to be defining community fairly broadly, but I am going to separate it into two elements. There's the relationship and rapport between the company and the players, and then there's the relationship and rapport between players and other players. So taken together, I think these are the two big pieces of what makes up a gaming community as a whole, although you can definitely throw in the relationship between players and their friendly local gaming store, since often the gaming store acts as a major third-party link between the other two parties. The gaming store sells Games Workshop products, and sometimes even at a discount, and they also provide gaming space for players to play, usually for free, or at least that's the typical business model in the United States. In return for free tables and terrain, the players are expected to spend a little money at the store, support the local store on new models and hobby supplies, and a symbiotic relationship going on there. I believe over in the UK you have more formal gaming clubs where members actually apply, get accepted, and then pay a monthly fee in return for use of tables and terrain, and that's how they fund it that way. So anyways, the point is there is another element to the gaming community in the friendly local gaming store or gaming club, but I'm not going to be including that in this video. For this video, I'm just going to focus on the company to player and the player to player relationships. And part of the reason for that is I argue that the friendly local gaming store acts as a magnifier of the other two relationships more than creating a unique relationship of its own. So in the past two videos, we've started with Games Workshop, and I don't see any reason to change that. So for the sake of consistency, let's keep it that way. Why don't we get the bad news out of the way first? So let's start with the negatives. Now, in terms of company to player community and communication, Games Workshop has made huge strides in the last few years, which was really good because at one point it was abysmal. Back in 6th and 7th edition, GW acted really snobby. It felt like we as players were supposed to be grateful for being allowed to buy their products and play their game and use it. There was very little communication with the players, and some of the policies that GW enacted as a company were just downright stupid. So here's a little bit of story time to illustrate the point. When I still lived in Arizona, there was a gaming store in one of the local malls, and I was absolutely ecstatic because I lived just 5 minutes away. But the first time I packed up my new models and drove down to the store, the manager said that it was policy that if you want to play on their tables, you have to have your entire army painted to a tabletop standard, which at the time meant 3 colors. And the models had to be based as well, and he honest to goodness would not let anyone put models on that table if they didn't meet that criteria. So I was a new player, I played fantasy, there were 20 models in one spearman unit alone, and I had an entire half-elf army there. So that led to a frenzied week of speed painting that made my army look like absolute crap, but at least now I could play on the table. So unfortunately, that kind of relationship, it turned the hobby side of the game into basically a chore or a tax. And now that my army was quote-unquote done, I had nothing to paint, but look at that. I could buy another army to actually enjoy the painting side while I actually played with the one I just hurried to finish. Maybe that was the intention, I don't know, but it left a really bad taste in my mouth. Now, my experience there might have been atypical, but I was a new player, I was a young player, I didn't know anybody else who played really. This was my only avenue to get a game in. Either I followed those rules to play a game, or I just sat at home and stared at my models. And, what was that going to do for me? So that's just one example of GW kind of failing to build a strong rapport between player and company. Another example of a failure at building this community was the disaster that was the End Times campaign. Like I said, when I started playing in GW products, I was a big fan of their fantasy stuff. So the whole idea with the End Times was that the narrative was supposed to be driven in part by player games. Players would play games, submit the results, and that would help to drive the storyline that was leading through this End Times campaign. But it kind of backfired when Chaos couldn't win anything. But the fluff kept coming out about Archaon rampaging through the old world even though Chaos wasn't winning. So it didn't make any sense. This was terrible. Games Workshop was consciously ignoring player participation because it didn't fit in with what they already had planned. Now, it probably would have been easier to just publish the remaining End Times book with a massive middle finger on them. That may have got the message across a little bit more clearly. Don't ask for player input if you're not going to listen to it. So that was also around the time GW really started suffering financially. They were reporting that revenues were remaining more or less steady, but the number of players was dropping dramatically. Their practices were driving away their customers. Now, let's go on to the positives here. Back to that GW store with the draconian painting policy. The positive side of that was that every Wednesday night, I think it was Wednesday night, it was fantasy night, and I had a day each week where I could go and play. And I got to know the small group of about half a dozen guys who went down every single Wednesday, and we got to know each other pretty well. We would play different games against each other. We'd test out new stuff. It was a really friendly, welcoming kind of place to play. Before that, I only had one opponent, and that was my brother. And I mean nothing wrong with that, but he had one army, I had one army. We didn't have any kind of terrain, so we played games on his kitchen table using cereal boxes and soda cans as terrain. And when you each have one small army, the games tend to get a little bit repetitive. So it was nice to have another place to play, other people to play, other armies to play against. Now, there were other friendly local gaming stores a bit further away, but there weren't as many people who played fantasy. Everyone else who went to those friendly local gaming stores tended to play this 40K thing, and at the time I was completely uninterested in that. With me, it was all spear and spell, baby. So that was my only option. But fortunately, it worked out, and I had a great time while I was able to play there. So that's one thing that was good about the GW stores. So another thing that they did right was GW started putting out these painting tutorials with this young guy that soon came to be the unofficial face of Games Workshop, who has now gone on to his own channel and his own paint line and all that kind of good stuff. But at the time, he was the face of GW. And it was GW saying, hey, here are these models. Everyone likes the paint scheme we have on the boxes. Let us show you how we do that. Then comes 8th edition. Now, I know there's some division over what people think of 8th edition, but what I want to focus here is that GW promised a massive overhaul of the entire game. And to tell us about it and kind of drip feed it to us and build up some anticipation and excitement, they started the Warhammer community webpage. They started sending out surveys to players. They started posting FAQs in a single, easy-to-find location. They actually started talking to us players as if we're real people. I know it was a crazy idea, but they finally started doing it. And I gotta say, it was pretty sweet. I know some guys get to work in the morning and they check their portfolios, others check their meeting calendars. I checked the Warhammer community page. Work could wait until I was finished with that. And as they drip-fed previews of rules and changes and models and built up all this excitement and anticipation for the new edition, I was all along for the ride. And what else was cool about that is, at this point, YouTube had pretty much taken off, and you had all of these channels like Mini Wargaming, Tabletop Tactics, Winter's SEO, Dark Artisan, and all these other channels who would comment on the rules releases, who would run test games and see what the rules looked like on the tabletop actually rolling dice. Even when we only had a few rules of just super basics, you couldn't possibly play a full game, people were excited and they were sharing that excitement, and we were able to watch them do it. Now, I think about that for a second. I live in the United States, and every single one of those channels I just mentioned is either in Canada or Great Britain. So I was starting to feel like a part of this group with people who didn't even live in the same country as me. I'd comment on their videos, and sometimes they would actually comment back. That's community. Everyone was united. Everyone was eager to see what this new overhaul would bring. And with Games Workshop using the community page both to inform and to advertise, the community absolutely exploded. So Games Workshop got a lot better communicating to us. Did the communication go the other way? And I think it did. So, for example, the release of the Sisters of Battle and the Leagues of Votan are an example that GW is listening to what the players want. Players have been demanding plastic sisters and bring the sisters into the mainstream for a long time. Now they got it. Same thing with the squats. The Fate of Conor campaign in the 8th edition, and more recently the campaign in 10th edition. where again they're trying out this idea of record the results of your games, and GW will let those results drive the narrative. And if you look at it, the Tyranids got the first release in 10th edition because that's what the campaign results said. Typically the Space Marines always come first. They're the flagship army. Now this could have all been rigged, but it certainly didn't look like it was. At least not like the end times. So as players, we felt like we're actually contributing to the development of the game, or at least the development of the narrative, at least in some tiny, tiny way. Okay, time for story time again here. As an example of GW listening to us talking to them. So I'm sure a lot of you remember the GW video where they made a joke that every time someone asked about bringing back the squats, Duncan would go and reset the clock. That was all funny, it was all well and good, but did any of you notice that when he went to the wall to grab the clock for the squats, next to it was a clock that was labeled Sisters of Battle, and the time on that clock was 11:55. That video was released in February of 2018. The very next month, they officially announced the Sisters of Battle collector box. So just a few weeks after that video, they make the huge announcement. I think that was an Easter egg. If you were looking for it, you saw it, and it showed you that not only were they listening to what the fans wanted, but they could be a little bit cheeky about how they communicated back to us that, yes, we heard you. So major kudos to them for that too. Okay, the last thing that I think is a good positive, at least in general, is the FAQ system. It's additional evidence that they have started listening. Now, we can absolutely disagree on how effective those rule changes are, how frequent they are, and who exactly GW is listening to when they make them. But let's at the very least acknowledge that they are listening and acting on it. And when you think about some of the things that have changed in 10th edition, I know there were changes in areas that I complained about and others that I played with complained about too, like way too many stratagems bogging down the game and just making it too complex. So they've reduced that. Okay, so that's a little bit about the community that GW has been building between itself and the players. Now, what about the peer community, player to player? Well, as with the lore, 40K GW has a huge advantage simply because of how long it's been around and how widespread it is. The game has had decades to grow and to expand, and it's big enough now that it's the only tabletop gaming company I know of to have its own chain of retail stores all over the world. And as I mentioned at the beginning, those stores are places you can go and find a game. Other companies might have a single brick and mortar store in the town that houses their corporate headquarters or something like that. But other than that, it's all friendly local gaming stores and third-party stores that serve as the main hub where players can go to look for other players and play against. So this makes the GW community one of its biggest selling points. If a town is big enough to have a hobby store, it's probably big enough to have a GW community. Now that if the town's not that big, it might not have a community for lesser known games. And I realize this is a bit of a circular argument. GW is popular because it has a big community, and it has a big community because it's popular. I get that. But the point here is you can find a GW community in just about any town you go to. Whereas with OnePage Rules, for example, nobody at my friendly local gaming store had ever played it before I introduced it to them, and most of them had never even heard of it. So this means that anyone wanting to get into tabletop wargame has a lot of incentive to start with Games Workshop games because the lore is good, the models are great, and because it has the most likely chance to find somebody to play. So I've purchased lots of other tabletop games and only been able to play them really sporadically or never gone much further than a demo game. So games like Malifaux, Carnival, Gaslands, Frostgrave, Bolt Action, Gunfighter's Ball, Don't Look Back, Rumble Slam, Project Z, and there's tons that I still haven't played. And this is just tabletop. We're not even going into board games and the ones that kind of straddle like Memoir 44. So many of these games are growing in popularity, others are super duper obscure. And if you're going to sink a ton of time and money into buying the game, building the models, painting it, learning a complex rule set, if it's your first foray, you're not going to want to buy a game that has a decent chance you're never going to get to play. You're going to buy a game that has a most likely return on investment, which means you're probably going to head to Games Workshop. Okay, so let's turn to another important feature of the player community that is both a blessing and a curse, depending who you ask and depending on the day. The competitive scene. Now, the popularity of GW games make it possible to have a very thriving tournament scene. There are at least a half a dozen major tournaments in the US that draw players from all over the country, all over the world. There might even be more. I'm not a tournament player myself, so I don't know. But I am aware of big events like the Las Vegas Open. So there's similar invitationals and tournaments like that in Europe as well, and I think that's great. The beef I have with it isn't the existence of the tournament scene, it's what the competitive scene does to the rules and to casual gamers, but that's a topic for a different video in the series. The point here is that OPR doesn't have a competitive scene. They've included rules for tournament play in their main rulebook, but those are just about administration, logistics. Hey, you want to run a tournament? Here are some ways that you can organize it. You want it, you build it. They're not sponsoring anything, at least not yet. Now, I know many of the major 40K tournaments they're not run by GW, they're run by third-party companies. So it's possible that someone might pick up and do the same thing with OPR. But until that happens, if you're a competitive player and you want to get into a competitive game that has a very, very large community of competitive players, you're going to have to go with Games Workshop. There aren't too many others. So that's a benefit, but it's also a serious drawback. And that's where competitive players and casual players have to share the same friendly local gaming stores. So I have seen many a game where the newbie shows up with his freshly built army, maybe not even painted, walks in for his first game on how to play. One of the store regulars is there, and rather than give this new guy a fighting chance, he absolutely curb stomps him into the ground. That new guy, especially if it's a young kid, is going to go home, stuff those models in a closet, and probably never play with them again. Now, if you and your friend are doing this and you have your first game together and you absolutely destroy him, he's probably going to make some kind of joke about your mom, and you'll both have a laugh, and you'll get over it. But if the new player is coming into the community without a friend, and like I said, especially if they're younger, it's a very different story. Now, usually the folks who run friendly local gaming stores, they know what players come to the store often who will take it a little easier on the newbie, give them a break, show them the ropes, but unfortunately the other scenario I just described still happens. So when we're talking about the player versus player community in tabletop games, it's actually two: competitive and the casual. And it's like a good Venn diagram. Sometimes they can overlap, but frequently they can't. Now lastly, and I'll be brief on this last part because of last week's video, the lore contributes to the growth of the community because it provides a common ground. The flexibility of OnePage Rules is great for forging your own narrative, but that means everyone else is forging their own narrative as well. I don't know, have any of you ever found yourselves in your friendly local gaming store, a Warhammer store, hanging out with friends, and suddenly you're involved in serious and heated discussion on the finer points of 40K and Horus Heresy history and narrative? I mean, I stepped back once during one of those discussions and suddenly realized to myself, wait a minute, we're talking about this stuff like it actually matters. Like, people were getting very, very passionate about which Primarch could beat up which other Primarch. Okay, I mean, that's all fun, but look at that as an example of building community. By giving you that core foundation of a narrative, it's easier for new people to come into the game because once they master a little bit of that narrative, they can now join in the discussion. They can be part of the group. Okay, so that then sums up Games Workshop. Now, we still have OnePage Rules to talk about, but don't worry, this won't take nearly as long. Being so new, OnePage Rules has to build a community from the ground up, but it gets to learn from some of the mistakes that bigger companies like Games Workshop made. So when OnePage Rules started taking off, they launched their own website that serves the same purpose as the Warhammer community page and includes areas where we, the players, can interact with the company. So there's the Writer's Jam that I mentioned last week. Patreon supporters get access to the OnePage Rules Discourse channel. I don't think Games Workshop has a Discord channel, and even if they did, they probably wouldn't let anyone comment on it, kind of like their YouTube channel. And we'll get to YouTube in just a second. On top of that, both OnePage Rules and Games Workshop, they both send me weekly emails with news about upcoming releases, events, things to get excited about. Now, Games Workshop's emails tend to be a bit behind the curve. That is, it's a summary of everything that the Warhammer community website has already covered that week. Whereas with the Patreon email I get from OnePage Rules, I get to see what's coming up. I get to see stuff in the early stages of development. Things like preliminary sketches, early 3D renders. I mean, I actually get to see what they're doing, what's coming down the pipeline. Games Workshop has the rumor engine. I never watched or looked at those very much. Usually I just skipped that article and went on to something else. I mean, someone else may have fun trying to tease out what it's hinting, suggesting at. I found it was always too little to really work with, but that's just me. All right. Well, if we're going to talk about community here and relationships between the company and the players and building that community, let's talk about YouTube for a second. So, OnePage Rules doesn't have a YouTube channel. Surprisingly enough. Not one for advertising, not one for painting, nothing. Instead, we are their YouTube channels. Now that's one way to get the community involved. Maybe it's a clever mixture of laziness and brilliance, maybe it's a little bit of both. But OnePage Rules just lists popular YouTube videos on their website. They let the fans, they let the players create all the content and the really good stuff. They'll link it to their own website. And how cool would that be to see one of your videos or one of your battle reports on their website? And by the way, OnePage Rules, if you're watching, let's talk. Now, GW did have something kind of like that. They used to have, maybe they still do, but I don't think so. They used to have the send us a pic of your model and we might put it up on our Warhammer store. And a friend of mine actually got his picture put up. He painted something for, I think it was his Horus Heresy army. And he sent it in and they posted it. So he was super excited to get his phone out and show us that if you went to the Warhammer store page for that item, down at the bottom when it said pictures from the community, there his was, right there. So that's pretty cool. Being able to show the guys you play with a photo of the model on the company website. OnePage Rules does that for battle reports. Games Workshop only shows the bat reps that they make and they produce with their own people. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen or heard about the great big video that Mini Wargamer Dave and Brett from Goobertown put out, playing a game of OnePage Rules. So that's another example of OnePage Rules letting the community kind of drive their YouTube and their video advertising, marketing, battle reports, community, all that good stuff. So between those two guys, Dave and Brett, they have more subscribers than there are people in the city I live in. So I'll bet a lot more people started looking up OnePage Rules after that game, and who knows, maybe that's how they found my channel here. Now that's community. So now let's compare this with what Games Workshop did to all those independent content creators on YouTube just before launching Warhammer Plus. Games Workshop tried to create a monopoly. OPR tells its players, go nuts, use our products, play our games, film it, show it to everybody. Now, I know Games Workshop didn't go after bat rep creators, but I know everyone who saw Astartes, everyone who saw The Last Church, and those kinds of videos got absolutely strangled out of existence. Now, I can't say for sure if OPR would or wouldn't do that, but when GW started really cracking down on those kind of content creators, people were they were absolutely flabbergasted. Did they not know how much free advertising those videos were? Did they not know how many new players were introduced to 40K through those videos? OnePage Rules recognizes that. So they're letting YouTube be free advertising for them while it still lets people get to enjoy and share their hobby. So a slight difference in how the two companies approach this. Okay, so after looking at the positives and the negatives from both Games Workshop and OnePage Rules, in the end, I would say Games Workshop has the definite advantage here. They have more to offer in terms of the ability to play games. They have a competitive scene. They have more resources to make their community a lot more shiny, so to speak. But just like with the lore, OnePage Rules is young. And I'd be curious to fast forward 10 years into the future and see how things look then. Because as some of you have pointed out in the comments, Games Workshop at one point was the tiny little company that nobody had ever heard of. And maybe OnePage Rules one day will be massive and huge like Games Workshop. And I'm especially curious to see what will happen if Games Workshop continues with some of the policies that they're doing now, which seem to be driving players away, and if OnePage Rules can learn from those mistakes. So again, in the end, I think Games Workshop is the quote-unquote winner here. But I do think with some time that One-Page Rules could definitely catch up. So let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know any amusing anecdotes or stories from playing games. And I will see you in the next video.